The fluorescent lights hummed their endless electrical song above Cedar Creek Medical's ICU, a sound so constant that most people stopped hearing it within a week. Rachel Torres had been there for 9 days. She heard every flicker, every slight surge in the current, the way a sniper hears the breath of a spotter 3 feet away in absolute silence. She moved through the unit at 6:56 a.m., before the permanent staff arrived, her movements economical and precise in ways that no one bothered to notice. The oversized scrubs hung on her frame like borrowed clothes, deliberately oversized, deliberately anonymous. Her name tag read R. Torres, temporary RN, in fading letters, the kind of credential that made people look away before they made eye contact. That was the point. That was always the point. The pre-dawn air tasted like hospital air everywhere, bleached linens, antiseptic, and the faint copper undertone of old blood that never quite scrubbed away from the grooves in surgical trays. She catalogued the medication dosages at the supply station without checking labels twice, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who had done this exact inventory under mortar fire in Ramadi, where hesitation killed people faster than bullets. The scars on her forearms caught the overhead light when she reached for the 14-gauge angiocath needles, thin white lines of shrapnel burns visible only for a moment before she pulled her sleeves down. They were old scars. They told stories no one in this hospital needed to understand. Room 347 was quiet at this hour. The monitors beat their steady rhythm, sinus rhythm, strong and regular, and the ventilator beside the bed wheezed its mechanical breath in and out, in and out. The patient was still sleeping, his face younger in unconsciousness, the kind of young that only hit you when you saw it vulnerable. Mid-30s maybe, with the kind of jaw structure that suggested military bearing and the kind of stillness that only came from violence survived. His chart read Marcus Webb, admitted 72 hours prior, training complication, no visitors cleared. The admission note was vague in the way that classified clearances demanded vagueness. Rachel changed his dressing with practiced efficiency, peeling back the sterile gauze to reveal a wound that needed more than bandaging. It needed precision. She threaded the suture needle with the muscle memory of 18 months at a forward operating base in Helmand Province, where the closest trauma surgeon was always too far away and hands like hers became the difference between dying and calling the medevac bird. Her suture technique was perfect. Cross-stitch repair, subcuticular approximation, the kind of closure that left minimal scarring and maximum structural integrity. The kind of technique that belonged in an operating room under a plastic surgeon's signature, not in a hospital bed at 6:52 a.m. under a temporary nurse's trembling hands. Except her hands weren't trembling. Webb's eyes opened mid-stitch. Grey eyes, alert immediately, the kind of consciousness that didn't have a transition between sleep and awareness. His gaze moved from her face to her hands, tracking the needle's path through the wound edges with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was watching. "You didn't learn that in nursing school," he said. His voice was rough from intubation, but the words came out steady and precise. Rachel didn't look up from her work. The needle went through the tissue layer again, exactly 3 millimeters from the previous pass, the spacing perfect. "Just finishing this. Lie still." "Navy," he said. "Not a question." "Army Medical Corps." She tied off the final knot, clipped the suture thread with scissors that had her call sign etched into the metal in letters too small for most people to see. "All done. Try not to pull the stitches." Webb's eyes didn't leave her hands as she disposed of the suture kit and documented the wound repair with clinical precision in his chart. 2 minutes of silence stretched between them, the kind of silence that two people who understood certain things didn't need to fill. The ventilator wheezed. The monitor beeped. Outside, Denver's streets were just beginning to wake. "How long were you forward?" Webb asked. Rachel sealed the chart and turned toward the door without answering. Some questions had answers that only existed in classified briefings and redacted files and the kind of conversations that happened in rooms with swept for electronics. She wasn't ready for those conversations. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Dr. Marcus Mercer arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 7:14 a.m., his Italian loafers clicking against the polished ICU floors with the confidence of a man who had never spent a moment wondering if he belonged somewhere. He was 53 years old, 3 generations of medical school tuition paid by family money, and he moved through the hospital corridors as if the building itself had been constructed in his honor. He'd been chief of critical care for 7 years. He noticed Rachel at the nurse's station before she noticed him, her oversized scrubs making her look smaller than she probably was, hunched over a chart with the posture of someone accustomed to taking up minimal space. His lip curled. He'd seen her file, temporary placement, 6-week contract, hired during the staffing shortage when standards had slipped like water through careless fingers. The kind of nurse who had probably trained at some state school in the middle of nowhere, probably carried student debt she'd never pay off, probably had no idea what comprehensive critical care required. He had trained at Johns Hopkins. Before that, Yale Medical School. Before that, Dalton Prep School in Manhattan. Before that, a 6-bedroom colonial in Westchester where his father had been a cardiac surgeon and his mother had sat on the boards of 4 different museums. "Good morning," Rachel said, glancing up as he passed. Her eyes met his for exactly 1 second before she looked back down at the chart. Deferential. Appropriately subordinate. Mercer didn't acknowledge her. He was already moving toward the unit manager's desk, where he could see the morning assignment board. Temporary nurses got the straightforward cases. Stable patients. Low acuity. That's how these things worked. You placed the inadequate staff where they couldn't do much damage. He paused at the board, scanning the assignments. There, Rachel Torres had been assigned to room 347, the SEAL patient, the one with the classified file that Mercer wasn't supposed to know about but had found out anyway because people talked and Mercer had a talent for listening to things that weren't meant for his ears. Perfect. If the patient coded, if something went wrong, they'd have documentation. They'd have evidence. The temporary placement wouldn't survive an adverse event review. And if she survived her shift without incident, well, that was just one more piece of data suggesting that her assignment to critical care had been a mistake from the beginning. Rachel moved through the morning with the kind of invisibility that only came from practice. She took vital signs. She documented medication administration. She checked the ventilator settings against the physician's orders and adjusted the bear hugger warming blanket to maintain the patient's core temperature within acceptable parameters. The things no one noticed. The things that were only visible when they went wrong. Webb watched her the entire time. His eyes followed her from his bed when she stepped out of the room, came back when she returned, tracked her movements with the intensity of someone analyzing tactical information. By 10 a.m., when the morning shift changed and the permanent staff arrived in clusters around the unit, he still hadn't looked away. Dr. Mercer made his first appearance during morning rounds at 10:23 a.m., moving from room to room with a cluster of residents trailing behind him like secondary predators following the alpha. They stopped at each bed, and Mercer delivered his assessments with the tone of someone accustomed to being correct about everything. At room 347, he glanced at Webb's chart without really reading it, his attention already on Rachel, who stood at the foot of the bed maintaining appropriate distance. "Temp assignment?" he asked, not looking at her. "Yes, sir," she said. 6-week contract. I have a BSN from Colorado State and current certifications in. I didn't ask for your resume. He turned to the residents, a half-smile crossing his face like a cloud passing over the sun. This is what happens when we hire outside the standard channels. No continuity of care. No accountability. None of the residents laughed. They had learned not to laugh, or at least not loudly. But their eyes shifted away from Rachel's face, the kind of collective social rejection that happened in hierarchies where the alpha had made it clear that certain people weren't worth eye contact. Rachel's jaw clenched for exactly 1 second. Then it released. Her hand stayed steady. Her eye stayed down. All the things a temporary nurse was supposed to do when the chief of critical care made it clear that her presence was a statistical error. What happened next changed everything. That was what Webb's eyes were tracking. Not her submission, but the absolute absence of it. She wasn't intimidated. She was just waiting. The way a tiger waits, perfectly still, while prey moves past without understanding that the only thing between life and death is a decision being made in absolute silence. By 11 a.m., Mercer had already made 3 notes in the staff record about Rachel's questionable charting practices and scheduled a one-on-one meeting for the following day. By 11:15 a.m., he had spoken to the unit manager about the liability implications of temporary staffing during critical care operations. By 11:19 a.m., he had positioned himself as the expert who had foreseen the problems that hiring shortcuts created. By 11:56 a.m., Rachel was still moving through her shift with the kind of precision that only years of training under actual pressure could produce, and Webb was beginning to understand that whatever this woman was, she wasn't temporary. She was exactly where she needed to be. And she had been waiting for this. The conference room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like stale coffee and institutional air conditioning. Dr. Marcus Mercer stood before 12 residents and 4 attending physicians, laser pointer in hand, Rachel's patient charts projected across the screen like evidence at a trial. "This," he said, circling her documentation with a red laser beam, "is what happens when we lower our standards." The pointer danced across her notes, each stroke deliberate, choreographed for an audience. "Notice the creative interpretation of protocol. From our temporary staff." The residents exchanged knowing smirks. Shoulders relaxed into the assumption that someone among them was lesser. Rachel stood against the back wall, hands clasped at her sternum, breathing measured and shallow. Her scrubs were immaculate. Her badge hung straight. Everything about her posture said compliant, apologetic, small. She watched the laser pointer desecrate her work without flinching. Without looking away. Without the tremor that would have made her human in this room, the tremor Mercer was hunting for like a predator reading prey. One tear escaped down her left cheek. It was perfect. Calculated. A single drop that made her look wounded instead of lethal. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with the screen. Mercer's voice rose another octave, riding the high note of manufactured authority. "I'm not even sure how she passed her boards. The gaps in her clinical reasoning are, well, they're stunning." The residents laughed on cue, the sound of hyenas at a kill. Someone in the back row took notes, documenting the moment they'd learned to dismiss her. Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The kind of clench that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't trained to read bodies in the dark, trained to distinguish mercy from murder with a single glance. The presentation lasted 14 minutes. By the time Mercer dismissed the group and clicked off the projector, every attending physician in that room had filed Rachel Torres into the category of acceptable loss. The residents would carry that message into the wards. The nurses would hear it secondhand. Within 48 hours, her reputation would be a controlled demolition, managed by a man whose only qualification was that he had the loudest voice and the oldest money. Rachel gathered her tablet and waited for the room to empty. She counted to 17 before she moved, a number she'd chosen because 17 was the number of Marines she'd stabilized during the Second Battle of Ramadi in a field hospital that was technically still under fire. 17. That had been a Tuesday. This was Wednesday. And she had hours left in her shift. 2 hours later, Dr. Mercer found her at the vending machine on the 3rd floor. He wasn't hunting for a drink. He was hunting for an audience. Rachel heard him before she saw him, the deliberate footsteps of a man who understood that noise was a form of dominance. His entourage materialized like a school of remorers, 6 nurses and 3 residents trailing in his wake, drawn by the promise of something public and painful. Torres. He let the name hang in the air like an indictment. "Did you even finish nursing school? Or did they give you a certificate for showing up?" She didn't turn around. The vending machine hummed its metallic song, indifferent to cruelty. Rachel inserted her dollar, watching the mechanical coil rotate and drop a bottle of water that she didn't want. "Because I'm looking at your credentials," Mercer continued, stepping closer, his voice pitched for maximum carry, "and I'm seeing a lot of gaps." A lot of gaps. He paused, timing the laughter with the precision of a man who'd practiced this particular performance dozens of times. The nurses giggled on schedule. The residents shifted their weight, uncertain but hoping to land on the side of whoever would grade them next. Rachel took one measured breath. She turned. Her eyes found his across a distance of approximately 6 feet, and something in that gaze caused the hallway to understand that it had just become a very small room. "I've treated sucking chest wounds in Ramadi with steadier hands than you hold that coffee, doctor." The words landed like stones in water. Each one struck something deep and disturbed the surface. The hallway went silent in a way that silence shouldn't be capable of, not a quiet, but a vacuum, a compression of all sound into a single point of tension. Dr. Mercer's face flushed crimson, the color rising from his collar like something was burning beneath his skin. His hand, the one holding the coffee, began to tremble slightly. He was trying to breathe through the humiliation, through the recognition that she'd just casually disassembled his authority in front of the people he'd brought to watch her be destroyed. "Perhaps security should escort you out," he said, his voice cracking at the edges, "before your substandard work kills someone." Rachel set the water bottle on top of the vending machine without drinking from it. She stepped past him, close enough that he could smell her antiseptic and something underneath it, something like old leather and hot sand and places he'd never been. The nurses parted instinctively, the way water parts for something moving through it with purpose. She was already 3 steps away when one of the residents realized what had just happened. The realization moved through the group like electricity. In room 347, Navy SEAL Lieutenant Marcus Webb heard none of this. But he heard the rumor that came next, carried by a nursing aide who mentioned it to an orderly who mentioned it to the day-shift respiratory tech who happened to pass by Webb's open door while changing his oxygen supply. Ramadi. Sucking chest wounds. Steady hands that didn't shake. Webb had served 14 years across 3 continents. He'd seen combat medics work under conditions that turned steel into liquid. Most of them didn't survive long enough to wear scrubs in a civilian hospital. The ones who did carried themselves differently. They moved like they'd already died once and survived it. This temporary nurse in the ICU moved exactly that way. Dr. Mercer spent the next 6 hours making phone calls from his office. He called the nursing director, casually mentioning that Rachel's credentials seemed questionable and perhaps someone should dig deeper into her background. He called a colleague at Denver General who owed him a favor, asking whether they'd ever heard of a Rachel Torres in their staffing network. He called the hospital's credentialing committee with concerns about his liability if someone with potentially false qualifications was working in his unit. Each call was precise, each one planted a seed of doubt that would grow into something requiring investigation. By evening, whispers had metastasized into something harder. She faked her credentials. She only got hired because of the staffing shortage. She's not even a real nurse. The stories multiplied and evolved, each retelling adding details that no one could actually verify but everyone felt comfortable repeating. Rachel worked through it all, changing dressings, monitoring vital signs, holding her composure like it was a thing made of titanium. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She simply existed in the hospital spaces, doing her job with the kind of precision that should have made everyone around her question the lies, but precision, when attached to someone already decided upon, just made her look coldly capable of deception. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless frequency throughout Cedar Creek Medical, indifferent to the damage they illuminated. Rachel finished her shift at midnight, clocked out with her badge, and walked to her car in a parking lot that smelled like rain and diesel exhaust. She had 17 text messages from her contact officer at Naval Intelligence, each one more urgent than the last. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the phone call she received as she pulled out of the lot, a familiar voice asking her to confirm her daughter's school pickup time tomorrow morning. Because tomorrow, everything was about to change. The attending physician, Dr. Chen, young and competent but new to trauma, stood at Marcus Webb's bedside at 8:22 a.m., the morning light cutting through the ICU windows at an angle that made everything look surgical and clean. Webb lay motionless on the bed, his chest rising with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, his Navy SEAL body finally still after 3 weeks of shallow pain and measured breathing. The procedure was routine. A chest tube repositioning, nothing more. Rachel stood at the medication cart 12 feet away, her hands moving through inventory with the efficiency of someone who had performed this task 1,000 times, her eyes tracking the monitors without seeming to watch them. She wasn't assigned to Webb's room anymore. Mercer had made sure of that with a single reassignment order at shift change, but the ICU was small enough that she could hear the ventilator wheeze, could feel the rhythm of his breathing the way a sailor feels ocean currents. The tube needed adjustment. Webb's oxygen saturation had been drifting downward for 6 hours. 92, 88, 86. The attending physician had consulted with the radiologist and made the call, repositioning at 8:45 a.m., before it became a crisis. Standard protocol. Nothing unusual. Rachel's hand stilled on the medication bottles, waiting for the sound that would mean something had gone wrong. It came at 8:49 a.m. Not a sound exactly, but an absence of sound. The ventilator's rhythm changed, stuttered, then climbed into a higher pitch that meant the lungs were fighting for space, fighting against something blocking the airways from within. A tension pneumothorax. The tube had shifted during the repositioning. Air was filling the pleural space. The pressure was building like a fist closing around Webb's lungs, and at 8:49 a.m. and 32 seconds, his oxygen saturation began its catastrophic drop, 84. 79, 72. 65. Rachel was moving before her conscious mind caught up with her hands. She didn't run. Running would draw attention. Instead she moved with the kind of efficiency that looked like walking but covered distance like a current, her trajectory aimed at the supply cabinet 3 feet from Webb's bed where the emergency trays were kept. The attending physician was still reaching for the phone. Still reaching. His mouth was open but no words had formed yet, and Rachel understood in that crystallized moment that Dr. Chen had never seen a patient decompensate this fast, had never experienced the specific paralysis that comes when the training and the reality suddenly collide and there's a 2-second gap where the brain refuses to accept what the eyes are reporting. She didn't wait for him to catch up. The needle was 14 gauge, sterile, already wrapped and waiting in the emergency decompression kit because Cedar Creek Medical was a level 1 trauma center and these kits were staged for moments exactly like this one. Rachel's hands moved through the sequence her muscle memory had written 2 years ago in Ramadi, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical landmark she could locate with her eyes closed because she'd had to locate it in darkness with a flashlight held between her teeth while a Marine's lung was collapsing from a puncture wound sustained during the Second Battle of Ramadi. The same battle where she'd sutured 3 femoral arteries with field combat dressing and caffeine and the kind of focus that exists only when the alternative is watching someone die. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. "What are you?" Dr. Chen finally found his voice, but Rachel was already prepping the site with chlorhexidine, her movements precise as a surgeon's, controlled as someone who had performed this procedure so many times that her body knew the steps before her mind acknowledged them. 65 saturation. 61, 58. The alarm had stopped wailing because no alarm could keep pace with the severity, and Webb's eyes were starting to show the white around the iris that meant his brain wasn't getting enough oxygen, wasn't getting enough of anything. "I've got this," Rachel said, and her voice carried the flat authority of someone who wasn't asking permission anymore. Wasn't asking for anything. The needle went in at the angle that avoided the intercostal vessels, perpendicular to the chest wall, through skin and fascia and the pleural membrane, and then the hiss of air escaping. That sound. That single, unmistakable sound of pressure releasing, of a pneumothorax decompressing, was the sound she'd been listening for since Ramadi, the sound that meant the patient would live, that meant the lungs had space again, that meant the crisis had transformed into something manageable. Webb's oxygen saturation climbed, 59. 64, 72. 81. The ventilator's alarm lowered its pitch, confused, then resolved into normal breathing. The monitors steadied. The room, which had been holding its breath, exhaled. Dr. Chen was staring at her with an expression that moved through 4 different emotions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, something that looked like shame, then a cold calculation that meant he understood exactly what had just happened and exactly what it would mean for his authority in the ICU. He was the attending. He was supposed to make these decisions. But she had moved faster. She had seen what he couldn't see yet. She had saved the patient in the 4-second window where it mattered. "Call respiratory," Rachel said, her voice already shifting into the deferential tone that would draw no attention, that would let her disappear into the background the way she was trained to do. The tube needs a full repositioning. This is a temporary fix. She was already stepping back from the bed, already returning to her default stance of quiet competence, already becoming invisible again. But her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes met Webb's for exactly 1 second, and in that second she saw him see her, not as the unremarkable temp nurse with the trembling resume, but as something else entirely. Something his SEAL training recognized immediately. Dr. Chen reached for the phone with shaking hands. The attending physician's hands were the ones trembling now, while Rachel's remained steady as surgical steel, and that detail would lodge itself in every witness's memory with the permanence of a photograph. She had moved with the fluid precision of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario, who had lived in the space between life and death long enough to understand it like a language. The needle decompression had taken 47 seconds. The room had gone silent except for the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, steady and confident, the way only machines and combat medics could be. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Mercer had been standing in the doorway for the final 32 seconds of the procedure, watching from the threshold with an expression that cycled through shock, then anger, then something worse than anger, recognition. He had seen her do something no temporary nurse should be capable of doing. He had seen her move with military precision through a medical emergency that required knowledge she shouldn't possess. He had seen her hands, and hands don't lie. Hands remember their training the way muscle remembers gravity. He had seen the truth written in the economy of her movements, and now he had exactly what he needed to destroy her completely. Rachel felt his gaze like a weight. She kept working, checking the line, noting the vitals, maintaining the performance of the temporary nurse who had gotten lucky and stepped in during a crisis, nothing more. But she could feel him moving through the equations, could feel him calculating the angles and the consequences and the opportunity that had just dropped into his lap like a gift. She had practiced beyond her scope. She had intervened without authorization. She had made the attending physician look incompetent by being more competent than he was. And she had done it in front of a witness who had every reason to want her gone. By 9:15 a.m., Mercer had made the first phone call. By 10:30, the second. By noon, the third and fourth. Rachel was inventorying the supply room on the 3rd floor when she received the message from the ICU supervisor. Her access had been revoked pending investigation. By 1:51 p.m., her credentials suspension had been formalized in an email she wouldn't see until later. By 3:22 p.m., the schedule had been rewritten, night shift, alone, her access to the ICU permanently restricted. By 4:15 p.m., Webb had been transferred to a different floor, a floor where the temporary nurse who had saved his life would never be assigned, would never work, would never know if he survived the night or if the tension pneumothorax returned when there was no one watching who knew what to do. She discovered the empty bed at 6:02 p.m. Room 347 was empty. The monitors were off. The 4 stands had been cleared. Webb was gone. The only sign he had ever been there at all was the slight indentation in the mattress and a single drop of saline on the floor that caught the fluorescent light like a tear. Rachel's hand started to shake then. Not from fear, she hadn't been afraid in Ramadi and she wasn't afraid now, but from the understanding that the mission had failed. She had been stationed at Cedar Creek Medical to protect Webb, to monitor his recovery, to ensure his security in the window where he was vulnerable. Mercer had removed him without her knowledge. Mercer had cut her off from the only patient who knew who she really was, the only thread connecting her undercover identity to her actual assignment. She drove home with her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the Denver traffic like it held answers. The highway was its own kind of dangerous, the way drivers moved through traffic like predators through tall grass, the way metal and momentum could collapse into tragedy at any moment. She kept her speed at exactly 62 miles per hour, exactly 5 miles under the limit, because drawing attention was the last thing she needed. Her mind was running through protocols, how to contact her handler, how to signal that the operation was compromised, how to recover a mission that had just shattered into pieces she wasn't sure could be assembled again. The kitchen table was where Mia had left her homework. Her daughter was 8 years old, small for her age, with dark curls that came from Rachel's mother and eyes that held the particular bewilderment of a child whose mother had always come home at exactly 11:36 p.m., who had never been early, who maintained schedules like soldiers maintained radio frequencies, with absolute precision. Mia looked up from her math worksheet, confusion breaking across her face like dawn. "Mommy, why are you home early?" Rachel couldn't answer. The words existed somewhere in her body, but they couldn't travel to her mouth, couldn't translate into language that would make sense to an 8-year-old who had learned very early that her mother was different, that her hands carried knowledge other mothers didn't possess, that some questions weren't answered even when asked directly. Mia's confusion shifted into fear at Rachel's silence. "Mommy." And then Rachel was crying, actually crying, her shoulders shaking in a way they hadn't shaken since Ramadi, since the moment they'd medevaced the last casualty from the hospital where she'd spent 18 months keeping Marines alive through sheer will and precise hands. Mia's face crumpled in response, a child's instinctive breaking at her mother's breaking, and suddenly they were both crying, and Rachel had her hands fumbling for the jacket she'd shed at the door, was pulling out the faded unit patch she'd sewn into the lining 2 years ago, the patch that was the only physical evidence that she'd ever been Captain Rachel Torres of the 1st Medical Battalion, that she'd ever been anything other than a temp nurse that nobody remembered. The patch was worn soft from 18 months of field use, faded from the desert sun of Ramadi, and it was the only thing in the world that mattered right now. Mia held it, confused and frightened, and Rachel realized in that moment that the mission wasn't the only thing that was failing. Everything was failing. Everything was collapsing. And she still had no idea what was about to walk through that door. Within the hour, Dr. Mercer's office became a command center of calculated destruction. He sat at his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his voice the smooth purr of a predator who'd already won. "Chief of Staff? Marcus Mercer. We have a critical competency issue in ICU. That temporary nurse, Torres, she performed an unauthorized intervention this morning. Needle decompression without physician authorization. It's a scope violation, pure and simple. I'm documenting it formally." He listened, nodded as if the voice on the other end could see him. "Yes, I'll file the complaint by end of business. We can't have unlicensed practitioners making life or death decisions." The lie slipped out like silk over broken glass. He ended the call and immediately dialed the board member's direct line, the one reserved for the hospital's financial elite. "Richard, Marcus here. Quick concern, we've got a staffing issue that could create liability exposure. Someone's been practicing medicine without proper authorization. I'm handling it administratively, but the board should know we're tightening protocols immediately. For phone calls. For different power brokers." By the time he hung up from the last one, a reassignment order to pull every experienced ICU nurse from her rotation, the trap was already closing around her like a fist. The schedule changed at 2:16 p.m. Rachel pulled it up on the break room computer and felt something shift in her chest, though her face remained blank. Night shift. Alone. No backup. No experienced nurses. Just her and a skeleton crew of first-year residents who wouldn't know a subtle sepsis presentation from a common cold. It wasn't incompetence, it was surgical. Mercer had isolated her with the precision of someone who understood that a soldier without backup was a soldier about to fall. She printed the schedule, folded it once, and slipped it into her pocket. The paper crinkled like a death warrant. Meanwhile, in the HR department on the 3rd floor, a woman named Susan Chen sat at her desk staring at a computer screen that had turned an alarming shade of red. The automated background check system had flagged something it rarely flagged. Most flags were credit issues, minor criminal histories, falsified degrees. This was different. The system had detected, and then cross-referenced through a restricted database, a classified security clearance. The kind of clearance that didn't belong in a temporary nursing file. The kind that made HR administrators very carefully not touch anything without explicit authorization. Susan's hands trembled as she reached for the phone. She didn't call her supervisor. She didn't call legal. She called a number that was printed on a laminated card, kept in her desk drawer for exactly this type of emergency, Naval Personnel Command, restricted access. The voice on the other end was female, precise, and utterly without warmth. Restricted access. I'm Susan Chen, HR Director at Cedar Creek Medical in Denver. I flagged a potential security issue in our personnel records. A classified clearance has been detected during a routine background investigation. Silence. Then, employee name. Rachel Torres. Torres. 3 seconds of nothing. Then the line disconnected. Susan sat holding the phone, listening to dead air, understanding that she'd just activated something far larger than hospital politics. She closed the background check file without printing it, deleted her search history, and locked her desk. Whatever was about to happen was no longer her jurisdiction. By 4:15 p.m., Rachel's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. No words. Just coordinates and a date stamp, 0200 hours. She deleted it immediately. Her cover was deteriorating like a building condemned from the foundation up. The Navy had seen the flag. Naval intelligence was watching. And in approximately 10 hours, when her shift started, she would be alone in a hospital with no support, no backup, and a patient who might not survive the night without her. She left Cedar Creek at 5:36 p.m., still wearing her scrubs because changing felt like acknowledging that this was ending. The afternoon light in Denver had that peculiar quality of late fall, golden and dying simultaneously. Rain was coming. She could smell it in the air, that ozone sharpness that meant the weather was about to turn violent. She drove in silence. No radio. No podcasts. Just the sound of tires on asphalt and the increasingly frantic chatter of her own mind telling her this was impossible, this was compromised, this was over. The kitchen light was on when she pulled into the driveway of the small rental house on Morrison Street. Through the window, she could see Emma sitting at the table, still in her school uniform, her backpack on the chair beside her. Rachel's chest seized. Emma knew something was wrong. 8-year-old children developed an instinct for parental disaster the way animals developed an instinct for earthquakes, a pressure change in the atmosphere that made them go very still and wait. Rachel pushed open the door and forced her voice into something approximately normal. Hey, sweetie. Why aren't you at aftercare? Emma's eyes filled with tears before Rachel even finished the question. Miss Patterson said I had to call you. She said you had to pick me up at 4:30. I called and called but you didn't answer and she said I could wait in the office and then I asked if I could come home and she said okay if I took the bus and the words fragmented into actual sobs. Rachel crossed the kitchen and pulled Emma into her chest, one hand on the back of her daughter's head, the other gripping the chair back hard enough that her knuckles went white. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady in that particular way of people who have learned to compartmentalize catastrophe. It's okay. I'm here now. You're safe. But Emma pulled back, studying her mother's face with the terrible clarity of childhood perception. Why are you home early? You said you had to work until tomorrow morning. You said that 3 times this week. Rachel had no answer that wouldn't lie to her daughter. She had no answer that would explain that her cover operation was unraveling, that her credentials were about to be suspended, that naval intelligence was about to make a call that would change everything. She had no answer except the truth, and the truth would terrify an 8-year-old. Emma's tears became hiccuping sobs of confusion and fear. Mommy, what's happening? Did you get fired? Are we moving again? I don't want to move again. I like my school. I like Ms. Patterson. Rachel moved to the bedroom and returned with a jacket she'd hung in the back of her closet. The one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. The one she wasn't supposed to touch. The one that meant everything was about to explode. She sat down at the table, pulled Emma against her side, and felt the weight of 2 years of operational security collapsing like a building imploded from the inside. Her hand trembled as she reached into the lining of the jacket. Not from fear. From the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding their breath for too long and is finally allowed to breathe, even if the only air available tastes like failure. The patch was still there. Faded desert tan. An American flag. A single star. the emblem of something Emma had no context to understand. Rachel pressed it against her chest and let her daughter cry, understanding that by tomorrow morning, everything would change. The investigation would escalate. Naval intelligence would move. And the small, temporary life she'd built in Denver would be consumed by the larger machinery of the operation that had always come first. The rain started then, hammering against the windows like fists demanding entry. In the darkness of the kitchen, a mother and daughter sat very still, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, that the world was about to come crashing through that door, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. The administrator's office was silent except for the rain hammering against the windows like fists demanding entry. 6 o'clock in the evening, and the room had filled in the last 14 minutes with people Dr. Mercer had not summoned. 2 naval officers in dress whites. A woman in a dark suit from the Pentagon, her credentials laminated and unmarked. A Marine Corps liaison whose jaw looked carved from the same stone as his uniform. The hospital administrator sat behind his desk like a man watching his career options narrow in real time. Dr. Mercer stood near the window, his suit still tailored, his confidence still wrapped around him like armor. He'd made his phone calls. He'd filed his complaints. He'd documented everything with the precision of a man who'd learned to weaponize bureaucracy. Rachel's credentials suspended. Her access revoked. Her cover at Cedar Creek collapsing under the weight of his strategic competence. He'd won. He thought he'd won. The Marine Corps liaison held a folder, its edges worn soft from handling. 43 pages. Rachel's citation. Her service record. The names of 847 lives saved during 18 months of forward operating base rotations in Ramadi. The folder was real. Everything in it was classified. The administrator's phone had rung at 5:22 p.m. That's when everything changed. A single call from a restricted number. Then another. Then 6 more from numbers that traced back to offices in the Pentagon. Not requests. Commands. The administrator had called the hospital's legal team. They'd advised silence. Then they'd advised lawyers. Lieutenant Marcus Webb wheeled himself through the doorway at 5:53 p.m. His discharge had been processed that afternoon. Cleared for release, lungs fully expanded, O2 SATS stable for 72 consecutive hours. His wound was healing clean. The needle decompression Rachel had performed 3 days ago, the one she'd executed with hand-steady as surgical lasers, had saved not just his life but the integrity of a classified naval intelligence operation that extended far beyond a single hospital in Denver. Webb rolled to the center of the room. His eyes found Dr. Mercer for exactly 2 seconds, then moved to the officers in white. Then to the woman in the dark suit. He knew exactly who everyone was. He'd been briefed 14 hours ago. Phantom 6, he whispered. The words landed soft as a knife. Dr. Mercer's face went white. I don't understand what's happening here. The Marine Corps liaison opened the folder. His voice was formal, ceremonial, the kind of voice reserved for reading words that change everything. Captain Rachel Torres. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Ramadi. She performed emergency medical interventions under active fire that saved the lives of 3 Marines during the Second Battle of Ramadi. Her training, her composure, and her refusal to abandon wounded personnel despite overwhelming enemy presence exemplifies the highest standards of military service. Each sentence was its own weight. Captain. Ramadi. 3 Marines. Combat operations. Heroism. The words hung in the fluorescent-lit office like they'd never leave. Dr. Mercer opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Protocol. There are protocols for classified personnel. I wasn't informed. I have a right to. The 2-star general entered through the door that had been open the entire time. Full dress uniform. Ribbons that told their own story of service. His eyes moved across the room with the calm authority of someone who'd commanded thousands of soldiers in active combat zones. He saw Dr. Mercer and looked away. He saw the administrator and nodded once. He saw Rachel Torres. He saluted. Not a casual military gesture. A full salute, arm rigid, hand steady, the kind of salute you give to decorations earned in places where you've held the dying and refused to let go. The general's salute acknowledged the captain insignia on Rachel's records. It acknowledged the Purple Heart twice awarded. It acknowledged the night she'd worked surgical sites in forward operating bases with no morphine, no antibiotics beyond what she could carry, no mercy except what her hands could provide. Rachel was not in the room. But the general was saluting her anyway. Captain Torres's cover is her operational mandate, the general said. His voice was granite. Her continued employment at Cedar Creek Medical is not negotiable. Her presence here was authorized by Naval Intelligence and approved by Joint Special Operations Command. Any interference with her mission parameters will be classified as obstruction of a federal counterintelligence operation. The woman in the dark suit opened a laptop. Her fingers moved across the keyboard without hurrying. Clinical. Precise. She turned the screen toward the administrator. We're showing your hospital's initial investigation into Captain Torres's credentials was initiated by Dr. Mercer personally. 6 hours after he witnessed her perform a medical intervention that saved a patient's life. She paused. That patient was Lieutenant Webb. A Navy SEAL. A high-value asset under protection protocols. Dr. Mercer's breathing was loud now. Shallow. I was following hospital procedure. I wasn't aware of any classified. You filed a formal complaint accusing her of practicing beyond her scope of licensure. The Pentagon official had a phone in her hand. Not personal. Military-grade secure line. She dialed. Let it ring once. Twice. A voice answered on the other end that made the entire room straighten. She spoke into the phone. Codename Phantom 6. Cover status, Cedar Creek Medical. Compromise level. She listened. Understood. She handed the phone to the general. The general spoke for words. Mission continues. Cover intact. Rachel was in the break room on the 3rd floor when her phone rang. A number she'd memorized but never called. She was alone. The vending machine hummed its electrical song. The coffee pot still held yesterday's brew, dark as motor oil. Her hands were clean. Her scrubs were bloodstained from a different code, a patient she'd saved, a life that mattered, a moment where her training had meant something. She answered the phone. No greeting. No names. Your cover is secure. The voice was military. Direct. Dr. Mercer has been contained. Your continued employment is operational priority. The asset is discharged. The threat is neutralized. Rachel closed her eyes. She'd been at Cedar Creek for 47 days. Her assignment was supposed to last 6 months minimum. She'd been ready for 6 more months of being invisible, of being overlooked, of being the temp nurse that nobody bothered to remember. Understood, she said. The line went dead. 48 hours later, the video went viral. 2 million subscribers on Marcus Webb's military podcast. He'd recorded an episode titled The Nurse Nobody Knew, and he described the vending machine incident with the kind of detail only a trained observer could provide. The theatrical pause Dr. Mercer held for laughter. The smirk. The loudly projected insult designed to carry across the assembled staff. Rachel accepting the humiliation without response. The single tear that escaped when the laughter peaked. Security footage existed. Someone pulled it. Posted it with the podcast audio running underneath. The internet identified Rachel, not her name, but her service record, floating in military forums where people knew how to recognize the invisible signs. Combat Medic. Army Captain. Ramadi, 2007. The comment section erupted like a breach. News outlets picked up the thread. Cedar Creek's phone lines melted down. The local news sent a helicopter. The hospital released a statement about privacy protocols and employee confidentiality. That statement got destroyed in real time by another voice, one that carried weight nobody could dismiss. Dr. Patricia Reeves, retired Army surgeon, former deputy commander of medical operations for Central Command, posted a video from her home office in Fort Collins. Her credentials were displayed on screen. Her words were careful. Devastating. I am ashamed to have trained Dr. Marcus Mercer. His public humiliation of a decorated officer, a nurse who saved lives under circumstances he will never understand, represents everything I fought against in military medicine. His attempt to retaliate against her for the crime of competence is cowardice disguised as professionalism. I am formally requesting that the Cedar Creek Medical Board review his fitness to practice medicine. The board convened 5 days later. Dr. Mercer sat across a table from 6 physicians and 2 hospital administrators. 43 pages of documentation were presented. His pattern of strategic sabotage. His complaints against Rachel filed immediately after witnessing her save a patient's life. His reassignment of staff specifically designed to isolate her. His phone calls to allies requesting character assassination. His fabricated documentation. His interference with patient care motivated not by protocol but by wounded pride. His allies on the board, the ones he'd called during his campaign against Rachel, recused themselves or voted against him to salvage their own reputations. The vote was unanimous. 5 minutes of formal deliberation. 43 pages of evidence. 20 years of his career ending in the time it took to read a single paragraph. Dr. Mercer drove a medical supply van now. The company hired him without checking references. Or they checked and didn't care. Medical supply delivery was necessary work. Someone had to do it. The van was white with red lettering. His uniform was polyester instead of pressed cotton. The pay was 1/3 what he'd made as chief of critical care. 3 months after his termination, he was making a delivery to Cedar Creek Medical. The loading dock was visible from the parking lot. Rain was falling, light this time, not the hammering assault of the night. Everything had changed. He watched from the driver's seat through the windshield as Rachel crossed the parking lot in her scrubs. Same quiet efficiency. Same invisible competence. Same hands that held lives together the way other people held coffee cups. She didn't look at him. Didn't need to. Inside Cedar Creek Medical, at the nurse's station on the ICU, Rachel opened her locker. Beside the extra scrubs and the backup stethoscope, there was a photograph. Her daughter, Mia, at school. Backpack visible. And pinned to that backpack, the faded unit patch that had once been sewn inside a jacket lining. Phantom 6's marker. The emblem of everything Rachel had been forced to hide. Mia knew now. She understood now. The tears at the kitchen table that night weren't weakness. They were the weight of choosing between mission and safety. Between being a mother and being a soldier. Between the 2 parts of herself that had finally, impossibly, become one. A new temp nurse arrived for the evening shift. Young. Uncertain. Fumbling with patient charts, assignments blooming like flowers she wasn't sure how to arrange. The charge nurse was barking orders. The temp nurse's hands were shaking. Rachel stepped beside her. "You're doing fine." The temp nurse looked up, startled by the voice. "Keep your head down," Rachel continued. "Trust your training. And remember, the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together." Marcus Webb was in room 347. Not as a patient this time. Visiting for his 3-month follow-up. His lungs were clear. His scars were healing. His discharge papers showed him cleared for full duty. He watched Rachel move through her rounds with the grace of someone who'd practiced the art of being unremarkable. She passed his doorway. He lifted his hand. Not waving. Saluting. Rachel nodded once. The search that had brought him to Cedar Creek 2 years ago, the search for the medic whose hands had moved like muscle memory through procedures only combat veterans understood, was over. She'd been hiding in plain sight. Saving lives with the same devastating calm. Waiting for someone to finally see her. Someone had. And the world, for one brief moment, saw her too. If you've ever been invisible to someone who needed you visible, share this story. Subscribe for more tales of the quiet heroes walking among us. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true strength? Because the ones nobody notices might just be the ones holding everything together. See you next time.